Starbucks has been a mainstay in business school literature and management training as a role model for innovation, branding, vertical integration, and corporate social responsibility. The impact of Starbucks is well known. They repositioned coffee from a cheap, simple, bitter medicine that the working class forced down before work into a fashionable, mainstream branded drink that people consume these days for taste and aesthetics as much as function. Starbucks made their stores into a casual third space between home and work, where people could come in, relax in comfortable chairs, hang out, and surf the web while sipping coffee. Neighborhood baristas provided essential frontline evangelism and preparation for first-time coffee drinkers. The uniquely experiential nature of the stores, their widespread presence, and the emphasis on service and product helped Starbucks not only introduce coffee to the masses, but also charge unprecedented high prices at $3 to $5 a cup. Thanks to efforts from its famous CEO Howard Schultz, Starbucks has carefully crafted a uniquely respected and celebrated image in academia, business, political, and investment circles over the past decades. See, Starbucks is not some basic coffee chain, but instead a forward-thinking, fast-growing, innovative, socially responsible company that always does the right thing for its customers, employees, investors, farmers, and the environment.
So the love and humanity is also about creating a value system in which the company stands for something in addition to making money, doing great things for the people that it employs and the communities it serves. And I think as a result of that, and this is not a U.S. phenomenon, businesses are going to have to do more and they're going to be called on to do more. I also believe that those businesses that do the right thing in the right way will make more profit as a result of doing the right thing.
Over the last 40 plus years, as Starbucks has grown from one store in the Pike Place market to over 19,000 around the world, I think the one thing that has stayed consistent has been our commitment to providing health care to all of our employees, all of our partners who work more than 20 hours a week. We saw firsthand that we were the only company in America, only retail company, providing this benefit to our people.
No one company has come into New Orleans and done a block of volunteerism that anywhere approaches what we're doing, with over 50,000 hours of volunteer hours.
And I got to see very up close and personal the values that Starbucks ascribes to. Its fundamental commitment to changing people's lives, investing in schools, investing in jobs, making neighborhoods better. That's the kind of company that I want to be a part of.
Over 4,000 African lives are lost every day to preventable, treatable disease. Dying for lack of drugs you can buy in any drugstore. 12 million AIDS orphans in Africa, 18 million by the end of the decade. A whole generation of active adults wiped out. Children bringing up children. It's not a cause, it's an emergency. We're going to do something about it at Starbucks.
This makes it all especially ironic that Starbucks, the poster child of corporate social responsibility and model employer, is now waging such a high-profile, visible, ugly war with its baristas across the United States, using every trick in and outside of the book to crush unions and squash any conversation of labor progression before it can form. While union efforts by retail workers are also happening at Apple stores, REI, Walmart, Target, and Amazon, none of these corporations have followed the scorched earth approach of Starbucks. While these companies intentionally keep themselves away from controversy through jargon and bureaucracy, Starbucks has opted to be as subtle as napalm. For a company that makes billions every year selling cups of syrup and sugar alongside glorified microwavables, surely the profits must be high. Can Starbucks really not afford to pay a few more bucks to its retail workers? In this episode, we'll dive into the business of Starbucks, strip away the corporate embellishment, and uncover why the company's image as a dominant, fast-growing business depends on successfully crushing unions in America. The coffee industry breaks down its evolution into three waves. The first wave was the 50-cent dark, bitter black coffee found in gas stations, diners, and dehydrated instant mixes in the 80s and earlier. Consumers then had little regard towards the taste of coffee, they valued convenience, and they pursued coffee as a cheap vehicle for caffeine. What Starbucks accomplished in the 90s was to usher in the second wave of coffee, elevating the drink into a social pastime, emphasizing bean varieties and origins, turning shops into destinations, hiring baristas as stewards, and broadening appeal of coffee through lighter, sweeter flavored forms like lattes, cappuccinos, espressos, macchiatos, mochas, and frappuccinos. Coffee continued to evolve with a third wave in the 2000s. Consumers started seeking greater sophistication like artisanal roasting, single origin sourcing, latte art, manual brewing, and diverse flavor notes, things that only independent shops could provide and big corporations like Starbucks, Dunkin', and Peet's cannot offer. The third wave of coffee is best represented by the smaller chains like Blue Bottle, Philz, and 4Barrel. Despite the trend towards third wave coffee, Starbucks has maintained success as an acceptable baseline. Its products still sell even if most of the menu and orders these days are much closer to dessert than coffee. Its stores remain packed across America, Europe, and Asia. In the world of food service, shops that sell beverages like tea and coffee generally enjoy higher margins than that of restaurants. Beverage shops deal with significantly fewer ingredients and far simpler preparation methods: water, milk, syrup, juices, fruits, tea leaves, and coffee beans. All of these ingredients come stable, ready to use, and can last for weeks with very low risk of spoilage. In contrast, restaurants must deal with a wider variety of time-sensitive ingredients that must be replenished weekly, require processing, and are far more perishable. While skilled labor is necessary to turn raw ingredients into palatable meals, making beverages have significantly lower labor requirements. Drinks are simplified for workers behind the scenes into easy-to-memorize recipe cards and choreographed movements that anyone can quickly pick up. The opportunity to make money is high when you're in the business of selling a consumable for $5 that only cost you $1 to make and can be assembled in seconds by a cheap minimum wage worker. The low barriers to entry and the massive paper profits is what drove Starbucks and continues to attract new entrants into the beverage industry in the form of artisanal coffee shops, bubble tea shops, smoothie shops, and juice shops. Beverage shops win on margin per transaction, but with smaller transaction sizes, they need volume to achieve profits. Volume is what Howard Schultz optimized for in Starbucks' rise in the 80s and 90s. It's impossible to cover Starbucks without mentioning Howard Schultz. Howard Schultz is a celebrity CEO who was not only integral to the company's past success, but also now the same exact person spearheading the company's public scorched earth approach to crushing its unions. In today's progressive political climate, where brands are just as likely to be canceled as individuals, waging a public war against your own workers would be a one-way ticket to termination for any CEO. While Tim Cook and Jeff Bezos opt for neutrality, Howard is in a league of its own on how outspoken he is on any form of labor progression or labor movements that do not come from the company.
Could you ever see doing that and embracing the union as part of it?
No.
Why not?
The primary reason is we are in business to exceed the expectations of our customers. 100 million people come into Starbucks. The customer experience will be significantly challenged and less than if a third party is integrated into our business. And
because they're not acting in good faith.
Because we have a different view. And Aaron, I don't want to spend the entire time in the union. Come on.
It is Howard's invincible, larger-than-life persona as the man who single-handedly built Starbucks alongside his high levels of social and political capital built through the decades as the champion of corporate social responsibility that has protected him from being vilified by the media, targeted by politicians, questioned by the board, challenged by his own employees, or pressured by investors. As a result, it's useful to first understand what Howard Schultz did in the past that grants him this present-day credibility and autonomy to crush unions. When Howard first stepped down from Starbucks in 2000, he handed the reins over to a series of executives who followed the classic MBA playbooks of operational consolidation, product simplification, cost-cutting, and relentless expansion. In order to hit the growth targets promised to Wall Street, these CEOs focused on opening a certain number of stores in every state and across the country. In the mid-2000s, Starbucks opened stores anywhere it could, sometimes even within a mile of each other, to impress investors and without the usual meticulous due diligence in site selection. As the stores scaled rapidly, the workforce was spread thin, so the company naturally focused on improving worker productivity to do more with less. Instead of using the conventional fresh coffee beans, Starbucks pivoted to more modern solutions like prepackaged ground coffee, powdered mixes, and automated machines. The overexpansion led to predictable sales cannibalization and declining retention, as customers naturally questioned why they were paying $4 for a cup of coffee made from a bag at Starbucks when they could get the same for $1 from McDonald's. These same CEOs also focused on growing ticket sizes by introducing food offerings, but predictably, they chose the cheapest vendors to maximize their margins. Howard Schultz was called back with a hero's welcome to save Starbucks in 2008. He moved to restore the authentic customer experience that he had formerly built the brand on, kicking out the inedible sandwiches, mandating coffee aromas in store, requiring coffee to be freshly ground, installing shorter machines so customers could see their drinks being made, shutting down hundreds of underperforming stores, introducing a new medium Pike Place roast and a light blonde roast, requiring coffee to be brewed every 30 minutes in smaller batches, and retraining baristas nationwide. Starbucks had lost its soul, and Howard returned it through public self-criticism and personable acknowledgement, a rarity for corporations back then, and a playbook that Domino's Pizza would copy just 1 year later to its own success. There were other wins credited to Howard during his second tenure as CEO from 2008 to 2017. He believed that CPGs, or consumer packaged goods, would be an important complement that would net higher profits than the core retail business. Coffee shops had been facing pressure from these new single-serve machines where consumers could make their own espressos and cappuccinos at home with a single pod and no mess. Starbucks had a partnership with Kraft in the mid-2000s to exclusively create coffee pods for Kraft's machines. When the computing Keurig system and K-Cups began taking off as the far more popular option, Starbucks broke off with Kraft and launched Via, its own platform-agnostic soluble coffee mix, and K-Cups to build up its CPG business. Under Howard, the company also rolled out Starbucks Rewards, which to this day remains one of the most successful customer loyalty programs. They started selling gift cards at big box retailers like Costco, which have contributed to the $1.3 billion of gift card balance sitting on the balance sheet today, and made Wi-Fi free at all stores. Over a decade later, Starbucks is still the only place in the United States where you can consistently walk in and get free Wi-Fi, with no questions asked and no purchase necessary. Pike Place Roast and Blonde Roast are now bestsellers, with Pike Place being the most popular in-store brew and the top-selling whole bean in instant and single-serve markets. Howard seized every opportunity to grow Starbucks beyond just a coffee chain in image, product, and fundamentals. He applied the same quality-first approach to food, opting for vertical integration in order to satisfy his exacting demands. Unsatisfied with the food options from external vendors, Howard bought out Le Boulanger Bakery for $100 million for the sole purpose of creating food products that he believed would be worthy of Starbucks. In 2011, Starbucks entered the fast-growing billion-dollar cold-pressed premium juice market through an acquisition of Evolution Fresh for $30 million to expand its core business beyond coffee and beyond a single brand. Diversification continued with entry into the $90 billion global tea market with the $620 million acquisition of Teavana. Howard championed corporate social responsibility at every opportunity through the 2010s. The company labeled its retail workers as, quote, partners, built agricultural centers overseas to teach locals sustainable farming, enforced ethical sourcing, and reduced employee attrition through proactive raises. The rationale that Howard presented was that all of these investments would build a stronger long-term business and that taking less profits in the short term to do the right thing would have compounding payoffs in the future. Howard's desire for control and exacting standards had also been applied to the company's approach to expansion. Rather than relying on the traditional B2C franchising model where individuals can apply to operate their own store, Starbucks relies on a stricter form of franchising where they partner with only established companies in a B2B arrangement. These companies are usually grocery stores, colleges, bookstores, hospitals, hotels, airports, and resorts, venues looking to generate more money from their existing land and with exclusive space to offer. The compensation is identical to that of franchising. Starbucks sells equipment, packaging, supplies, coffees, teas, and food at wholesale quantities to licensed stores who then resell those products to customers at higher retail prices. This is why some Starbucks stores won't accept your gift cards, they'll have different prices, and they won't participate in rewards. If you've ever seen a Starbucks that's inside a Target, a Safeway, an airport, or a train station, that's a licensed store. Partnering with other businesses helps in not just getting Starbucks into exclusive, desirable venues that are not publicly available, but also to maintain control. In the various fast food companies we covered in past seasons, like Burger King, McDonald's, and KFC, individuals who are running franchises are much more liable to subvert standards, rules, and regulations to make the most out of their primary investment. Starbucks has greater confidence and lower risk in these B2B arrangements, as established companies have little incentive to cut corners or jeopardize their brand, especially as Starbucks to them is just safe supplemental income and not their primary business. The physical areas that licensed Starbucks stores occupy in airport terminals, big supermarkets, train stations, and college campuses are by nature isolated venues, which reduces competition with the corporate stores for customers and eliminates cannibalization. Under renewed emphasis on customer experience and product quality from 2008 to 2017, Starbucks roared back to success, with revenue skyrocketing from $10.3 billion to $22.3 billion. The CPG business, made up of the Via instant coffee mixes, K-Cups, ready-to-drink bottled frappuccinos, Evolution fresh juices, and Teavana, grew from $674 million in 2010 to a $2 billion business by 2017. The CPG business enjoyed 40+% operating margins over multiple years. Despite a near 200% increase in sales over 7 years, the CPG business accounted for at most just 11% of Starbucks' total revenue in a single year. Revenue to Starbucks from licensed stores in the form of royalties, fees, and wholesale sales was even smaller, accounting for on average just 9% of revenue. The biggest revenue stream by far has been the direct food and beverage sales from company-operated stores, which stood for 80% of revenue on average from 2008 to 2017. Upon re-establishing Starbucks' leadership in coffee, Howard resumed expansion. In the 8 years between 2009 to 2017, Starbucks stores worldwide grew 50%, from 16,000 to 27,000 locations. Company-operated locations scaled by 40%, from 8,800 to 13,000 locations, whereas licensed Starbucks stores grew by 60%, from 7,800 to over 14,000 stores in the same period. Licensed stores were more important for cost-efficient international expansion and less needed for domestic growth. Starbucks in North America would scale at a much slower pace, from 11,000 to 16,000 locations, as the majority of the domestic fleet would remain company-owned and operated. Overseas, Starbucks grew from 5,500 stores to over 10,000 stores across Europe and Asia, with licensed stores making up the majority. Starbucks' retail business, on the other hand, is split by geography and not store type, meaning that all stores in Europe, Asia, and America are reported as 3 separate segments. In America, the majority of stores are corporate-owned and operated and contribute over 60% of Starbucks' annual revenue. The operating margins across both licensed and corporate-operated Starbucks in America hovers in the low 20% range. Wages paid to retail workers were the second highest expense behind rent and raw ingredients by $200 to $300 million every year. In comparison, the European business for Starbucks has been disastrous. In 2011, net revenue from Starbucks stores in Europe was $1.04 billion, and 6 years later, net revenue had dropped below $1 billion. Despite investing more into licensed stores and scaling from 1,800 locations in 2012 to nearly 3,000 locations in 2017, the Europe business had not improved by any meaningful measure in Howard's tenure. Operating margins for Starbucks in Europe were equally low, hovering at just 9.8%, and would drop even lower in the coming years after Howard's exit. The success of Starbucks in Asia, specifically in China and Japan, has continually masked the underperformance of Europe. In 2016, Starbucks was operating over 2,000 stores in 100+ cities across China, with over 500 in Shanghai alone. Winning China was a long-term strategy that Howard had put into motion back in 2000 before he initially stepped down, as he saw the Chinese to be the single largest market for coffee outside of Americans. China's fast-rising and fast-growing middle class enthusiastically embraced Starbucks over the year, making the country an invaluable profit engine for the coffee chain. The number of Starbucks stores in Asia exploded from 3,000 to over 7,000 in just 5 years, with the vast majority of those openings being in China. The Asia business overall grew from $400 million in 2011 to a $3.2 billion business by 2017. Starbucks' Asia business, which at this point was overrepresented by China, enjoyed operating margins comparable to that of the United States in the low to mid 20% range. Wages paid to workers in Asia were still the second highest expense behind rent and raw ingredients, but the gap between the two was sizable at $400 to $500 million difference every year. Howard stepped down in 2017, believing Starbucks to be in a good spot to hand off. It had a strong business in China, a positively trending business in the United States, a foot in emerging markets like juices and tea, an encouraging CPG business, new promising products like the upscale Starbucks Reserve and Nitro Cold Brew, and most of all, a compelling image of a forward-thinking, innovative, fast-growing, socially responsible company that was far more than just a coffee chain. He handed the reins to his COO, Kevin Johnson. In his 4 years at the helm and through the pandemic, Kevin prioritized growth in China, sold off Teavana to Unilever at a loss, and signed away the global rights to market, sell, and distribute any and all Starbucks CPGs like K-Cups and instant coffee to Nestle. Starbucks walked away with a $7 billion check from Nestle and with a profit-sharing stake from future sales, but effectively gave up on its own CPG business. This was counter to Howard's vision, as the CPG business was one he had built up to improve the company's margin, appearance, and future prospects, all of which had been continually dragged down before by the fundamentals of its retail business. Starbucks' operating margins over the years had been trending upwards from the low teens in the mid-2000s to the high teens by the late 2010s, thanks to the strength of its China business and greater contribution from its CPG business. Yet following a failed presidential campaign, Howard Schultz could not keep away from his life's work and forced his way back in as CEO in 2022. This time, the Starbucks that Howard inherited was completely different from the one he had stepped down from 4 years ago. In the United States, coffee is no longer the draw for Starbucks. These days, millennials and Zoomers make up 51% of the customer base. Over 76% of beverages sold at Starbucks in the United States today are cold drinks, and over 60% of all drinks sold are customized. This change can be seen on social media, where influencers and customers show off their frighteningly colorful concoctions and stomach-churning creations with record levels of cream, milk, sugar, and artificial flavors. Quote, "Cold beverages have surprised us all at Starbucks, but our ability to customize beverages is a significant competitive advantage. There is no other coffee company anywhere in the world that has our ability to respond instantaneously to a customer's request about customization, nor is there a coffee company that has our ability behind the counter in terms of flavors, syrups, modifiers, foams, etc., to provide the customer what they want. It is a weird world that we live in when the largest coffee chain in the world boasts its competitive advantage as having the biggest collection of Torani syrups." When we look at the demands of the Starbucks worker union, their requests are relatively straightforward. They want protection against no-notice terminations, guaranteed hours, and of course, higher base pay starting at $20 per hour for all workers in all states. Using the company's financials, we can calculate what would happen if these unions were to succeed and if Starbucks was forced to raise the salaries of workers in the United States from $15 an hour today to $20. From a pure cash perspective, given that Starbucks takes home $3 billion every year in net income, paying $5 more per hour per worker is clearly possible. The question is more of what is the cost to Starbucks' margins and by extension their image. We start with what we know. We know that a Starbucks worker in the United States on average earned $15 an hour in 2022. We also know that Starbucks employed 248,000 retail workers at its company-operated stores in the United States. There are a total of 35,000 Starbucks stores worldwide today, with 18,000 of those being corporate-owned and operated locations, and 10,000 of those 18,000 are stores in America. 10,000 company-owned and operated stores divided by 35,000 total stores tells us that company-owned and operated locations in the United States represent 56% of all Starbucks stores in the world. Starbucks states that it paid out $8.1 billion in 2022 in wages for retail workers. Given the representation of corporate-operated stores in North America, we can assume that 56% of worker wages, or $4.5 billion, was paid out amongst the 248,000 retail workers that Starbucks employed in the United States. The remaining $3.6 billion in wages went to paying the retail workers in Europe and Asia, which at quick glance seems logical. Retail workers in Europe, on average, have higher than U.S. compensation, while workers in Asia earn compensation that's significantly lower than the West. Plus, we know that Starbucks' European business is much smaller than that of Starbucks' Asia business, both in scale and revenue contribution. Next, we assume that the average Starbucks worker in the United States worked 25 hours a week and worked 48 weeks in a single year for a total of 1,200 billable work hours. We divide our $4.5 billion in U.S. retail worker wages by the number of workers in the United States and then by the number of total billable work hours every year to get the hourly compensation per worker. Our final output of $15.40 matches what we know, which is that the average worker compensation at Starbucks in the United States that year was roughly $15 an hour. If we repeat the same exercise, but this time we set the hourly pay to the union's demand of $20 an hour and work in reverse, holding everything consistent, we see that the total wages in 2022 would have been 16% higher at $9.5 billion if the unions had taken over. If we apply this difference of $1.38 billion more in operating expenses, we can see how Starbucks' operating margin in 2022 would have dropped from 14% to 10%, which is an operating margin that's comparable with full-service restaurants and lower than even Chipotle. Even if we say that our calculations are off and that an increase to $20 per hour only results in a 6 to 9% bump in annual total wages and not 16%, the operating margin still goes down by 1 to 2% and moves closer towards single digits. When we strip away all the top-line growth and corporate marketing, Starbucks can't hide the reality that at its core, its economics are fundamentally the same as a restaurant, with ingredient costs at 30%, labor and rent at 50%, and the remaining chewed up by administrative overhead, leaving a company with respectable cash flow, stable income, but perpetually low margins. When China went into a multi-year lockdown during and after the pandemic, the Starbucks Asia business went down with it. This put greater pressure on the American Starbucks business to perform and to compensate for both the underperforming European business and the slow openings across Asia. Without its CPG segment, Starbucks is now exclusively reliant on its core retail business for both income and a growth story. The pressure to maintain profits in Starbucks' American business is further exacerbated with the uncertainty of China, who has clearly demonstrated that it's the government who runs the show there, and companies will operate as they deem fit, which is liable to change any time. The threat of unions, even if it seems distant and small at the moment, is one too great for Starbucks to ignore, especially in the company's most reliable and highest grossing geography. Unions would not only increase labor costs significantly, but also make them fixed costs and drop Starbucks margins overnight into single digits. And the longer that Starbucks operating margins hover in the low teens or worse drops into the single digits, the more the company's fundamentals will look like any run-of-the-mill food and beverage business, and the harder it will become for Starbucks to maintain its image as the socially responsible, forward-thinking, fast-growing company with great future potential deserving of praise, recognition, and high PE ratios. Business is as much optics as it is product, and if crushing unions and suppressing worker wages is the difference between being seen as a high-flying, high-potential, innovative industry leader versus a top-heavy, conventionally fragile, maturing, legacy food service business, Starbucks, like any big corporation, will do so without hesitation. Morning Brew is a sponsor of this episode and the leading business newsletter read by millions of people every day, covering headlines from Wall Street to Silicon Valley. Morning Brew has recently launched a new daily podcast show which runs down the most important and interesting business stories you need to know every morning. Check out Morning Brew Daily YouTube by searching for it or clicking the link in the description. Stay entertained and informed and get the brew's signature style served up every morning. If you're interested in staying up to date on the most important stories happening in business, the economy, and everything else, Morning Brew Daily is the show for you.